Hey guys, how's it going? Today I thought I'd talk a little bit about my internship at Google this past summer since it's something that a lot of people seem really interested in and I always get questions about that. So in case you're not aware, Google actually has two different internships that they do for software engineering. So the first one is called STEP now. It used to be called EP, and it's basically a program designed for freshmen and sophomore students. And the idea is that you work with another partner on a project for the entire summer and um, basically like work together rather than being on your own. So the other internship is called the Smee Internship, which is a little bit more general. It's typically reserved for juniors, but you can get it any year, basically. When I did it, there were freshmen, there were high schoolers, there were graduate students, and so on. But anyway, so the idea of the Smee is you're on your own, working for a team, and you develop a project independently. So the Smee internship is obviously geared towards juniors, but I actually ended up getting it my freshman year, which was pretty cool. So I decided to come up with some tips based on how I think I got it. So first of all, this is probably the biggest tip. Google recruiting can kind of be a mess sometimes. So a lot of people's applications seemingly get ghosted out of nowhere, even when they're given good feedback, and this certainly happened to me. So one of the biggest things that I can give as a piece of advice is trying to find a referral before you apply. This wasn't something I did, and I totally regret that because I didn't really realize what a referral meant. In my head, a referral meant like nepotism, where someone was just giving you the job because they knew who you were. But in reality, it's a lot different than that. It's really just a way to kind of vouch for someone and say that this is someone you should probably interview. So definitely something you should do. If you know anyone in your network who's worked at Google in the past or currently works there, that's a great way to get a referral. If not, you can always go on like LinkedIn or whatever like career services your university has and try to network around, see if you can find any alums who are currently working at Google and just introduce yourself, like ask if you can grab coffee with them or even just for advice for how to get a job there. And a lot of people will be really happy to help you out. Another thing that you can do if that's not an option for you is there's websites like Blind and like Reddit CS career questions where you can find a lot of people who will actually be willing to vouch for you if you kind of just talk to them and explain who you are, because at the end of the day they get a bonus if they have a successful referral. So one other thing that I think helped me a lot early on in the application was there was actually a recruiting event at my school. I go to Georgia Tech, if you don't know that. And anyway, so this event was a tour of the now kind of closed Atlanta office, but a lot of Google employees and former interns came and introduced themselves, gave us some tips on how to apply, toured the office with us, and this was an awesome event. I didn't actually get to submit my resume, so I didn't apply through it, but I'm sure that my name was kept on a list somewhere and that showed that I was interested in the job. And more importantly, I actually got to talk to a few engineers who gave me a lot of really useful advice, like how to actually study for their interviews, what the interview format is like. And another thing that was probably the best advice I got was I was told to actually apply to both the EP and the Smee internship, which I wouldn't have known to do. And it would have sucked if I didn't, because I instantly got rejected from the EP internship. So yeah, good piece of advice. You should always apply for both for every company, even if you're a freshman. Still apply to junior programs. So anyways, right after this event that I attended, I just went online immediately and applied. Don't wait to apply to places because there's not really much that you can do in the few months in between, and being in the system early gives you a big advantage. So anyways, a few weeks later, I finally heard back. I got an email giving me a link to a coding challenge, I think. It was called like the Google Coding Snapshot or something like that. And I made the stupid decision not to actually study for it. I figured that it probably wouldn't be too hard, and I ended up being right, but yeah, it could have gone really badly because I certainly got denied from a lot of other coding challenges. The actual question here wasn't too bad. It was something around the lines of like FizzBuzz, so I ended up lucky, but I've heard that other people have had much tougher questions. So after another day, I got an email from a recruiter telling me that I was getting moved on to the next stage, and they said that there was a questionnaire I should fill out. And I realized that there was no questionnaire in the email, which was kind of the first time I actually realized that I was talking to another human and I had been ghosting the recruiter the entire time. So that was kind of an L on my part, but I cracked a joke and managed to make it out of there, not having them hate me, because I'd pretty much ignored every email that came my way up until then. But anyways, the questionnaire was basically just fill out your interests, maybe like GPA, stuff like that. Wasn't too complicated, and I don't think it had much impact in the process. So after that point, my application kind of vanished into like an interview limbo where I wasn't sure if I was actually interviewing for real. And it was super confusing on my part. I never applied anywhere else. I didn't really know what the process was like. But basically, just ping your recruiter as much as you can. Be courteous and nice, but you have to kind of push them to get things done a lot of the time because they're so busy. So yeah, after that, everything went pretty smoothly. I got an interview request not too long after. But it was like 2 or 3, maybe 4 weeks before I actually heard back about the interview, which was a pretty long time, and I was pretty nervous that entire time. So as you might have guessed, eventually I did actually get my first interview. And if you're not aware of how Google does their interviews, it's a little bit weird, especially if it's your first time interviewing anywhere. But basically the process for an internship is you have 2 phone interviews in a row, like back to back. Each one is, I think, 45 minutes. I'm going to change that now, but somewhere around that length. And it's typically 1 coding question per interview. And so each one is also done with a different person. And the basic process is they'll give you like a pretty simple problem at the beginning and kind of start to build up on it. They sometimes will talk to you about your resume and stuff like that, but not for more than like 2 or 3 minutes most of the time. So yeah, those types of questions aren't super important. The question format is pretty much like Leetcode, medium, hard, easy, somewhere in the mix. Really depends on who's interviewing you. But one of the things that's really useful, and a lot more useful than the actual studying, in my opinion, is Google kind of rates you based on a different scale than just like completing the problem, how long it took you, and like things like that. The real thing that they're looking for is your thought process. So if you haven't actually seen what a Google interview looks like, there's a lot of really helpful videos on YouTube where they'll have a Google engineer go through an interview. I put a few links to those in the description, but definitely watch that if you have an interview coming up, because it's a really informative video, and it's a very different format than what you'll probably expect as the candidate. The only other thing with that is Leetcode is super important. I didn't give it enough attention when I was applying, but I definitely did a few like hash map problems at the advice of a friend before applying, and that was super important because otherwise I probably never would have made it past this stage. So the first question that I got was that you're given a string and it has some letters repeated, and you have to figure out whether or not it's a real word. So basically the way that it works is you want to see how many of the repeated letters you can eliminate. So for example, if you had the word Google and it had 3 O's in a row, you know it can't be a word because no word has 3 O's. But if you remove 1 or 2 of those O's, then it might be one. So they give you a function that you can check whether or not a string is a real word, and you basically have to eliminate like repeated letters and figure out what it is. Now the trick here is that you can't just eliminate them naively. You kind of have to guess the different combinations. So for example, if you saw Google with 2 O's, you would know that it could be a word as is, or maybe you have to take out one of the O's, and then it could be a word like Google. And for words with like 3 letters in a row, you would have to eliminate those. The other thing you have to realize is that there can be multiple sets of repeated letters, so you have to find every possible combination. I think that was actually what the challenge of the question was, because it didn't seem like they cared too much about performance or speed or things like that. They really just wanted to see if you could use recursion or another method to find all the different permutations of the string. So the way that I solved it was I just took the string and I recursively looked through it, checked if the first letter was part of a repeated string, and if so, then I tried the 2 different combinations and added those to a list, I think. So essentially you just go in like one by one, you see the G not repeated, so you just move on. You see the O's, so you say it could be 1 O, it could be 2 O's, and anything past that you would just get rid of. And you kind of branch off with the 2 different directions. So the first direction is if it's 1 O, and then any subsequent characters can be either repeated or not. And if there's 2 O's, then you can do the exact same thing. So there's 2 sets of strings every time there's repeated characters. So the second interview was actually a little bit different, and it was pretty weird compared to what most other people get from Google, so I wouldn't put too much thought into this, but I spent probably 35 out of the 45 minutes just talking about my resume with the guy. He was super intrigued by like some of my experience because I had done a lot of stuff with compilers and with like lower level stuff, and he was also intrigued by the fact that I used OCaml, which is like a non-existent language outside of like Jane Street. But anyways, we just talked about my resume for most of the time, and at the very end he gave me a problem. I think the question was something like, you have a set of like people in a company, and it has like relationships with whose boss is who. So it's basically like a tree of employment, and you have the person at the top wants to send out an email to every employee. So the idea is you want to figure out what order it gets to the different employees in, and you have like a list of like how long it takes for each employee to hear from their boss. So the first way I solved this was like really dumb, and I didn't really put much thought into it because I had like 10 minutes left, but I was like, oh, just send them all out and just time how long it takes. And then I'm like, wait, that's just a sleep sort. So I managed to save it, I think, when I answered that, and I just made it like a tree traversal thing. But yeah, you definitely have to like actually try to solve the problem instead of like cheesing your way through it. And I'm really lucky that I think the guy liked me, because otherwise I could have definitely been rejected for messing it up initially. I also don't think that my code at the end really worked, but because of the short time, it wasn't that big a deal. So a few weeks went by, and I was thinking I did pretty well, but obviously didn't hear anything back. And when I finally did, it was actually not what I expected, which was they were asking me to do a third interview. I didn't even know that was an option, but you know, I think I messed up the email problem enough so that they didn't really have like conclusive feedback about me. So they asked me to do a third interview, and this one was actually the weirdest by far. So I pretty instantly realized that this was the hardest interview question I've ever had, and I was like super scared about it. I think the first part was they give you a string with like parentheses on either side, and you want to make it so that the parentheses are like balanced. So for example, every open parenthesis is matched by a closed parenthesis, and there's no like out of order one, so like a closed one can't come before the open one. And what you had to do was you had to eliminate the minimum number of parentheses to make the string still valid. So that part was like kind of straightforward enough. There's a good solution for it on geeksforgeeks.com that you can look into. But what made it really hard was that once I solved that, they gave me a second part, which was do the exact same thing, but find every combination of strings that has the minimum number of parentheses. And at this point, I was like totally lost. I haven't been able to find that question online. It doesn't mean it's not there, but it was super weird, and I couldn't think of a good way to make it in like a performant amount of time. It was like an exponential solution or something crazy like that. Basically brute forced it. So after that, I talked with the interviewer a little bit, and this is where it's super important to know how like the Google interview works, where you can actually get feedback from the interviewer, and it's an important part to getting the job, I think. So after discussing it with him, he gave me like some tips about how I can improve from brute force, and I used that to find like some places where I was repeating work and things like that. So I used like some dynamic programming or something like that just to save work and make it a little bit faster, but obviously it was still a pretty awful solution in the grand scheme of things. So after that, I remember having the feeling that I was definitely rejected and I had no chance. And at the very end of the call, like during the question session, the last thing I asked was, so out of interest, how was I supposed to solve that? And I actually got a really surprising answer out of that. He told me that he didn't really have any real solution, and he just wanted to see how I thought about this problem. And he just told me that basically the idea is just to see how you can optimize it once you have a brute force solution. So that was pretty interesting, and it made me feel a little better, but I was still kind of thinking I would get rejected. So I was super surprised when I actually heard back that I was moving on again. So anyways, a few weeks later, I got the positive news back from hiring committee and was told that I would be moving on to host matching. And host matching is basically a stage where you've passed all the interviews, but you still have to find a team that wants you over the summer. And so at this time, I had like a friend who was in a really similar boat. He had just gotten the third interview and then moved on to host matching. And he was kind of just sitting in limbo there. Didn't hear any interviews back, and eventually they just rejected him. So I was super scared that something similar would happen to me, because a lot of people were talking about how if you don't get a job in like a month, then you just get kicked out of host matching. So when I actually got like the form to fill out, I went super in depth about like all my previous experience, projects I'd worked on, projects I was interested in, things like that. So basically you get like a questionnaire where you're just filling out those types of questions, and then they give you like some example teams and you say like whether or not you'd want to work on them. So I went super heavy for like compilers stuff, operating system stuff, graphics stuff, anything low level. But then I also went back and said like I'm still interested in all these other things as well. So I think that was pretty helpful, but I actually got lucky and got an interview request from someone on the Node.js team. So the project that they pitched to me was working on Node.js to add a feature for WebAssembly bindings. So what that meant was you could write a library in WebAssembly and then load it up into Node.js and just call into it. So this was already something that was kind of possible before, but the goal was to make it really easy to do and make it easy to port libraries to that. And I found the team super interesting, and the project obviously was right up my alley with compilers and low level stuff. So this was my first interview, and I actually really liked the team. I emailed my recruiter back and said that this was something I wanted to work on, and I got really lucky. Next day I got the offer for that. So yeah, that's not something that happens to most people, I think, but if you really show like good interest and whatnot, then you'll usually get the job, I think. One other important thing is that they aren't really looking for like technical interview stuff during this. They'll read through your resume and see what kind of experience you have and what your interest level in that is, but they don't really care about the technical stuff because hopefully you would have already been like taken out of the process by the technical interviews at this point. So you shouldn't really worry about that. No need to practice Leetcode if you've made it to the host matching stage. So in retrospect, looking at the entire process as a whole, luck was a huge component, and it's hard to say whether I really like deserved the job, I guess. But I think that's an important takeaway in its own right. So one thing that you have to kind of realize is that CS interviews are super random. Everyone's going to do better on some questions than others. And the questions are kind of just bullshit 90% of the time. So luck is a huge part of it, and don't feel bad if you don't get the job your first try. You can pretty much always re-interview and try again. And as I mentioned before, this is something that you can definitely go out of your way to solve. So things like networking with recruiters, going to on-campus events, getting referrals from like school alumni or people in your network, all of those are super useful, and that's a great way to kind of give yourself the extra edge early on in the process so that A, you're getting the interviews, and B, you're not just getting rejected because you weren't like the number one person they saw. It's a good way to kind of indicate that you could be a good employee, and then they'll try to give you a second chance usually, which is pretty nice. So anyways, since this was my first video, I'd really appreciate some feedback on the format and things like that. If you like the video, please give it a thumbs up so that I know I'm doing something good and other people can find it. And if you're interested in more stuff like this, I have a lot of other videos in the pipeline, so you guys should really subscribe. I'm going to do some videos about like schoolwork, internships my second year, other companies I applied to, things like that, and then just some general advice for like resumes, interview practice, cover letters, things like that. So if you're interested, please take a moment and subscribe. I'd really appreciate it. Thanks.